Today, I want to share with you a story that's close to the heart. It's about a woman named Lydia Mercer, a young mother, cast out by her town for a crime she didn't commit, with a baby in her arms and another on the way. Lost, tired, and carrying more than just the weight of her children, she finds an unexpected refuge in the hills and a mind whose silence speaks more than most words ever could. Now then, let's begin the story. The wind clawed at the open prairie like it had a grudge. Dry, sharp air scraped across Lydia Mercer's cheeks, tugging at her shawl and seeping through every seam in her threadbare coat. She kept one arm tight around her belly, 6 months along now, and heavy as grief, and the other wrapped around her daughter Hazel, barely a year old and silent for too long. Hazel didn't cry anymore. That worried Lydia more than the wind or the empty stretch of land ahead. The child had simply curled against her shoulder and gone quiet, eyes half-lidded, breath thin. Lydia stumbled to a stop near a rise of land, where a cluster of dry cottonwoods leaned like old men, brittle and bent. Her knees nearly buckled as she lowered Hazel to the frozen grass. The mule cart she'd paid for back in Dalton had broken down near noon. The driver, a man with no name and a nervous glance, had offered neither help nor apology, just turned the mule around and rode off, leaving her alone with a crying child, a belly too big to bend over properly, and nothing but prairie in all directions. That had been hours ago, maybe more. She hadn't planned to come this far west, or alone, or in winter. Sitting now against the rough bark of the tree, Lydia pressed her hands to her lower back and exhaled through clenched teeth. Everything hurt. Her feet swollen and raw, her stomach tight with strain. Even her heart felt sore, bruised from weeks of holding back tears. She closed her eyes, just for a minute, just to catch her breath. 6 weeks ago, she had a home, a kitchen with warm bread in the oven and a crib by the fire. A husband, Martin, who kissed her hand every evening when he came home from the town hall, who read aloud to Hazel in a voice that turned every nursery rhyme into something grand. Then the sheriff came. Then the trial. Martin had been accused of embezzling township funds. Lydia never saw a penny. She barely understood what they were saying before it was over. A week later, he was hanged at sunrise, and the town turned its back on her. She tried to stay, sold the house to repay the debt, donated her wedding ring, but they still looked at her like her skin carried his sins. No one would hire her. No one would speak to her in church. She wasn't the widow of a man. They called her the wife of a thief. So she packed what she had left, took Hazel, and left. There was no destination, just a direction. West, where nobody knew her name. A rustle in the grass snapped her eyes open. Hazel was gone. Panic surged through her chest. "Hazel," she croaked, pushing herself upright, staggering toward the trees. "Baby!" She spotted the small bundle of blue wool crawling toward a shadow. No, a figure tall and still, standing just beyond the tree line. Lydia froze. The man wore buckskin. His long black hair was tied back in a leather thong, and a hunting bow hung from one shoulder. In his left hand, a rabbit dangled by the feet. In his right, he reached slowly toward Hazel. "No!" Lydia shouted, stumbling forward. "Don't touch her!" The man didn't flinch. He crouched instead, setting down the rabbit, then offering both hands open-palmed. Hazel, to Lydia's astonishment, giggled. She reached for the beaded necklace slung across his chest. Lydia reached them breathless, gathering Hazel into her arms. The child nestled in, content. "I'm sorry," she gasped. She wandered off. I didn't mean—" The man studied her silently. His face was unreadable, carved in quiet lines, his eyes dark and calm. He glanced down at her belly, then to Hazel, then back again. "You shouldn't be out here." he said. His voice was low, edged with the accent of a man who knew both English and something older. His tone was not unkind. "I don't have anywhere else to be," Lydia whispered. They stood in silence for a moment, the wind cutting through the grass, the sky turning dusky overhead. "My camp is near," he said. "You can come. The fire's warm. There's broth." She hesitated. Every tale she'd ever heard as a child warned of men in the wilderness, of dangers unknown. But she was already so cold, so tired. And Hazel had stopped shivering. That was the scariest part. The man turned and began walking, not looking back. Lydia followed. It wasn't far. A narrow trail wound through the brush, leading to a shallow hollow. There, nestled against a ridge, was a small lean-to of hide and branches. A fire crackled near a ring of stones. The scent of pine smoke and slow-cooked rabbit greeted them like an embrace. The man gestured toward a log. Lydia sank onto it, cradling Hazel, who had already dozed off again. The man added wood to the fire, his movements steady and practiced. "My name is Nate," he said finally. "Nate Lone Hawk." Lydia nodded, adjusting her shawl. "Lydia Mercer." He stirred the broth pot. The firelight flickered across his face, casting soft shadows on his cheekbones. "You come from Dalton?" he asked. She nodded. Not by choice. He didn't press. Didn't ask why a white woman with a child and another on the way was wandering the prairie alone. Instead, he handed her a tin cup with warm broth. She drank slowly, savoring every mouthful like it might be her last. Hazel snored softly in her arms. "Thank you," Lydia whispered. She wasn't sure if she meant the fire, the food, or the quiet. Nate said nothing. He merely nodded once, then stood on the other side of the fire, eyes on the stars as they began to gather above. And for the first time since the noose tightened around her husband's neck, Lydia didn't feel like she had to keep moving. She just listened to the fire and let herself stay. Lydia awoke to the smell of wood smoke and dew. The sky above the hollow had turned from slate gray to soft peach, morning stretching its limbs across the hills. Hazel still slept against her chest, warm and limp, mouth parted slightly in peace. For a moment, Lydia didn't remember where she was. Then the crack of firewood snapped her back. Nate stood a few yards away, crouched beside the fire. He wore the same buckskin shirt, the sleeves rolled to his forearms, revealing strong hands that worked a blade along a piece of wood. He was carving slow, measured strokes that peeled the wood like ribbons. He didn't look up when she stirred. Lydia shifted on the log, wincing as stiffness rolled through her spine and hips. Sleeping upright with a toddler and a belly full of baby wasn't forgiving. She stood slowly, adjusting Hazel in her arms. "You slept," Nate said without turning. "That's good." She nodded, brushing dirt from her skirt. "I think I forgot what that felt like." He said nothing, only set the knife and carving aside, then moved to the fire and stirred the embers. "There's coffee, not strong but warm." Lydia hesitated before stepping closer. He offered a tin cup, the handle warm from the fire. She accepted with a quiet, "Thank you," then sat on the edge of the log again. Hazel roused not long after, her little body stretching like a kitten's. Nate handed her a small piece of dried apple without a word, and Hazel accepted it like a treaty. They sat that way for a long while. No words, just the sound of fire, soft chewing, the breeze in the brush above the hollow. Lydia was surprised at how natural it felt. In town, vigilance always felt full of judgment. But here, it had weight. It was permission. "Do you live here year-round?" she asked finally. Nate shook his head. "In summer, I stay higher in the Red Hills. This spot keeps warmer in winter." "Red Hills?" she repeated. He nodded toward the horizon. "East Ridge, reddish soil. My mother called it Sacred land. The last place our people gathered before they were driven north. His voice wasn't angry, just factual, like recounting the weather. Lydia lowered her eyes. I'm sorry. You didn't push them, he said. Then added, but your people did. She accepted that without reply. He wasn't wrong. He stood again, brushing dirt from his hands. I'll check the traps. There's rabbit left from yesterday if Hazel's hungry. I can cook, she offered, if there's a pan. He paused a moment, then nodded. Cast irons by the fire pit. As he disappeared into the trees, Lydia exhaled for the first time all morning. Her mind felt clearer than it had in weeks. Maybe because Nate didn't ask questions. Maybe because, for once, she wasn't being stared at like a ghost. She cooked slowly, grateful for something useful to do. Hazel toddled near the edge of the clearing, chasing shadows and fallen leaves. Lydia watched her closely, heart thudding every time she wandered too far. By the time Nate returned, she had a small meal-ready rabbit hash and a biscuit made from leftover flour. He said nothing when she handed him a plate, only gave a small nod, and sat across from her on the log. They ate in peace. You have people? She asked him. Nate chewed, swallowed, then nodded once. Farther north. My cousin's family winters near Wind River. I visit come spring. But not your wife. He looked at her then, eyes steady. She died 2 winters ago. Sickness took her and our son. Lydia's breath caught. I'm sorry, she whispered. He looked away. Sorrow's part of the land. We all carry it. She couldn't argue with that. Later, she rinsed the plates in a nearby stream, while Hazel threw pebbles and giggled at the splash. Nate whittled another piece of wood nearby, occasionally glancing up when Hazel wandered too far. Lydia watched him, watching her child, something unspoken curling in her chest. As the sun climbed, Nate showed Lydia how to patch the lean-to with fresh branches, how to dig a small trench for runoff in case of rain, and how to split kindling so it caught faster. She followed his motions, hands clumsy but eager. You learn fast, he said simply. I have no choice, she replied. That night, as she rocked Hazel to sleep and wrapped her shawl tighter, she stared at the small fire and felt something strange settle over her. Not comfort, not safety, just steadiness. The stars returned one by one. Coyotes howled in the distance, but the fire stayed bright, and Nate remained a quiet silhouette across the flames, carving a small wooden animal in his palm. Lydia watched him, her voice soft. You don't have to keep letting us stay. He didn't look up. You haven't asked for anything. I've already taken more than I deserve. At that he paused. You haven't taken. You're surviving. That's different. She let his words hang between them, warming her more than the fire ever could. She didn't know how long they'd be here, or what would come next. But for now, there was food in her belly. Her child was sleeping safe. The fire hadn't gone out, and she didn't feel quite so alone. The first snow came early. It dusted the hills like powdered sugar, soft and deceptive. Just a shimmer at first, no more than a warning. But by the end of the week, the ground had hardened, and the wind sharpened its teeth. In the hollow, Lydia stood outside the lean-to, wrapping a thick wool blanket around Hazel, whose cheeks were red as apples and nose runny from salt. Inside, she said gently. Frost's biting. Hazel pouted, but obeyed. Toddling back toward the small cabin, Nate had begun to reinforce with pine logs and cedar branches. What had started as a temporary shelter now resembled something steadier. More permanent walls thickened with mud. The fire pit covered with stones to trap heat. A kind of home, even if no one had called it that aloud. Lydia paused at the threshold, one hand resting on her belly. The baby moved beneath her ribs, a slow roll that made her breath hitch. He'd grown restless in recent days. It wouldn't be long now. Her back ached constantly. Sleep came only in pieces inside. The fire crackled in its ring. Hazel curled up near it with her rag-stuffed doll. And Nate sat at the far end of the room, shaping another figure out of wood. This one looked like a horse, its legs still rough, its tail only half carved. Hazel had begun collecting his carvings, a small menagerie of rabbits, a bear, a bird with a crooked wing, and kept them lined up neatly near the furs where she slept. "You've nearly got a whole ranch now," Lydia said with a faint smile, sitting beside her daughter. Hazel grinned, pointing at the new piece. "That's for the baby," she declared. Nate looked up briefly, then returned to his work. "She says his name is Luke," he murmured. Lydia glanced at her daughter. "You told him that?" Hazel nodded proudly. Lydia hesitated. "It was Martin's favorite name. I didn't think I'd get to use it." Nate's carving slowed. "Then it's a strong name." She wasn't sure if he meant Martin or the baby. Maybe both. That night, after Hazel was asleep and the fire had burned down low, Lydia stood outside the cabin, breathing in the cold. Her breath curled like smoke. The moon hung low over the red hills, making the snow shimmer like glass. Nate joined her without a word, his presence like gravity. "You don't have to keep building all this," she said quietly. "You didn't ask for us." "No," he agreed, "but you came anyway." She turned her head, studying his face in the moonlight. "Why are you helping me, Nate?" He took his time answering. "When my son died," he said, "I buried him in the Red Hills. Same ground my father hunted on. I told myself I'd speak to no one after that. No more teaching, no more carving, no more English. The world had taken enough." He looked at her then, his voice softer. "But the world kept spinning, and one morning, I heard laughter in the trees. It was your daughter." Lydia felt her throat tighten. "She walked straight to a place that she didn't belong," he said, and laughed like it was already hers. Lydia swallowed the lump in her throat. "Hazel's like her father. She sees the good in everything." Nate didn't reply, but his expression shifted something softer, almost wistful. Over the next days, the snow deepened. Lydia moved slower, her body tightening with every motion. Hazel helped where she could, fetching kindling or folding cloth. Nate hunted more frequently, bringing back squirrels, pheasant, even a small deer once, which he dressed and hung while Lydia looked away, grateful but queasy. On the 5th day of snow, Lydia woke to a hard, low ache in her back. It didn't go away. By midday, she was gripping the doorframe, breath short, sweat dampening her brow despite the cold. "It's happening," she said, eyes wide. "Nate, it's time." He didn't ask questions, just moved quickly, efficiently. Laid fresh hides over the furs, stoked the fire, boiled water in the cast-iron pot. Hazel was tucked safely in the far corner, with a carved rabbit and a strip of sweetened dried apple. Then he came to her, hands steady. "I've delivered one before," he said, "a long time ago. My cousin's wife." She nodded, trying to be brave. The contractions came hard. The hours blurred. She forgot everything but pain. The wind howled outside, like it was being kept from something wuthred. Nate's voice, calm and measured, broke through between waves of agony. "Breathe. Push. Good. Can't she see?" It felt like her body might break. Her spine, her ribs, her heart. But then, as the fire crackled and Hazel whispered lullabies to her rabbit, a new cry pierced the air. A boy's cry. Nate caught him with practiced hands, cleaned him gently, wrapped him in warm cloth, and placed him against Lydia's chest. She sobbed. "Luke," she whispered. The child quieted. Hazel crawled close, peeking over Lydia's arm. "He's small," she said. Nate knelt beside them, his expression unreadable. but his hands still steady. He placed a carved wooden horse beside the newborn, its surface smooth, edges rounded. "For him," he said. Lydia looked at him, tears on her cheeks, a smile trembling across her face. "You're part of this now, you know." Nate didn't reply, but he didn't walk away either. That night, 4 souls slept beneath the same roof. The fire burned low. The wind sang through the hills, and Lydia dreamed for the first time in months, not of running, not of fear, but of stillness, of voices whispering in the snow, of a child's laughter and the slow, patient rhythm of a man carving life back into his hands. Outside, the red hills watched, ancient and silent. But inside the hollow, a new family had begun. The snow began to thin in early March. It melted in slow trickles down the hollow's slope, soaking into the ground until the once frozen earth gave off the smell of thaw and memory. Lydia stood at the edge of the ridge, rocking baby Luke in her arms, while Hazel tossed pebbles into the muddy stream below. Life had fallen into a rhythm, quiet, firm, steady. Nate had built a smokehouse beside the lean-to, and they now had a dry store of meat, potatoes, beans, and flour, from a trade with a passing trapper. Lydia mended clothing and kept the hearth burning. Hazel learned to say the names of animals in Apache. Luke slept easily, curled in a cradle Nate had carved from pine. It wasn't luxury, but it was life. And more than that, it was theirs. That afternoon, as clouds rolled low across the valley, Nate stepped back into the hollow, his face taut. "You've got company," he said simply. Lydia turned, instinct tightening her stomach before she heard the sound hooves on thawed earth. She stepped forward, shielding Luke with one arm and calling out for Hazel. By the time the riders reached them, Nate was already standing in front of the cabin, his bow unstrung, but his posture unmistakably watchful. Lydia joined him, Hazel clutching her skirts, eyes wide. There were 4 of them, all white men. One she recognized immediately, Eli Bell, the former town clerk from Dalton. He looked older, thinner. The other 3 strangers. One wore a tin star pinned to his coat. Another had a smirk Lydia remembered from the courthouse gallery. The 4th didn't speak, but his eyes kept flicking to Nate, distrust curling in the lines of his mouth. "Well, well," the smirking one said, reining in his horse. "Ain't this domestic?" The man with the badge cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer, you've been hard to find." "I didn't realize I was being looked for," Lydia said coolly. "You're still under scrutiny for unpaid restitution," he replied. "And now you've crossed into another territory without formal notice. There are laws, Mom." "I paid everything I had," she said. "You know that." Eli Bell finally dismounted. He looked like a man with something heavy in his coat pocket. Guilt. Or maybe truth. His hat was in his hands. "Lydia," he said softly, "we didn't come to take you. I came to speak to you." She stiffened. Nate didn't move. "Then speak," Lydia said. Eli looked at the others. "Give us a moment." The one with the badge hesitated. "You sure?" Eli nodded. "She deserves at least that." Reluctantly, the others turned their horses and rode a little ways off, though their postures stayed alert. Nate remained beside Lydia, unmoving. Eli looked at him, then back at her. "I didn't think you'd end up in the wilderness," he began. "I didn't think I'd end up widowed, pregnant, and spit on in the street either," she said evenly. "I came because I was wrong." His voice cracked. "Martin didn't steal that money." Lydia's breath caught. "He was covering for someone," Eli continued. "The mayor. There was a second ledger. I found it after Martin was hanged. He faltered. "I kept quiet. My wife, someone threatened our boy. Said if I spoke up, it'd be the last time I tucked him in." Lydia blinked hard, but her voice stayed steady. So you let them hang an innocent man. He looked down. I did. Hazel clung to Lydia's leg, eyes narrowed at the stranger. I'm sorry, Eli whispered. I've written everything down. It's going to the papers in Cheyenne, to the church board, to anyone who will listen. You won't be seen as a criminal anymore. Lydia looked at Luke in her arms, then back at the man who had once sat beside her husband at town meetings. Will that bring him back? No, Eli said, but maybe it'll stop them from doing it again. Silence stretched. Nate watched Eli without blinking. I left something, Eli Safety said, voice quieter now. 2 months ago. It was me. The food. The land deed. I couldn't face you then, but I wanted you to have something real. Lydia exhaled. Her body trembled not with rage, but with exhaustion. You should go, she said finally. Your part's done. Eli nodded slowly, eyes glassy. If you ever need more, I'll be where truth finally belongs. He mounted and rode off, without waiting for the others. The men followed, glancing back once, but they didn't speak. Not a word. The sound of hooves faded into the hills. Lydia stood frozen. Hazel tugged at her skirt. Mama? The girl whispered. Lydia knelt, placing Luke in the cradle basket beside the door. She pulled Hazel close and held her. I'm here, she said softly. We're here. Behind her, Nate didn't speak. But when she stood, he met her eyes. That truth, he said, cost him something. She nodded. And it still doesn't pay the price. Nate tilted his head. But it might free you. Lydia thought of her husband's name dragged through mud, buried under shame. Of her children's future, free of whispers and pointed fingers. And of Eli, walking away with the weight of a man who would carry what he failed to stop. That night, as they sat around the fire, Lydia unfolded the land deed. It was simple, signed with a shaky hand. But it was hers. The land beneath her feet. The hollow. The stream. The trees. All of it. She passed it to Nate. He studied it, then handed it back. You don't need my permission, he said. No, she said, smiling faintly. But I'd like your company. Hazel curled up between them, her new wooden deer tucked in her arms. Luke slept beside the fire, face peaceful. Outside, the wind had gone still. For the first time since she'd left Dalton, Lydia felt not just safe, but rooted. Tomorrow would come, and the past would still be out there. But tonight, she had her children. She had the land, and she wasn't running anymore. It rained the next morning. A slow, soaking kind of rain, the kind that dug deep into the earth and stayed a while. The kind that made the smoke from the chimney curl straight and white into the sky. It dripped from the overhang in steady rhythm as Lydia sat by the door, Luke in her arms and Hazel curled beside her, humming to her carved animals lined neatly on the floor. Inside, the air smelled of wet wood, boiled potatoes, and cedar smoke. Outside, everything felt washed clean. Nate had gone early, saying little, only that he was checking traps before the creek swelled. Lydia had watched him disappear into the trees, his shoulders squared, the rain soaking slowly into his coat. She could sense something behind his silence, heavier than the weather. The children were calm, but Lydia's thoughts roamed. Eli Bell's confession had not lifted the weight she thought it might. Instead, it settled something deeper, chiste, cold, like ashes that refused to blow away. The truth was out. Martin was innocent, but he was still dead, still buried without a grave marker, still gone from Hazel's memory before she could speak his name. Lydia reached for a strip of cloth and began wiping the table. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm, but her mind wandered. Did she want to return to town now, clear her name? Did she want to press charges? Or see Eli again? No. She didn't want courtrooms or revenge. She wanted peace, roots, something her children could grow into, not run from. When Nate returned, soaked to the knees and quiet as ever, she didn't ask questions. She handed him a towel, nodded toward the stew pot, and waited. He dried off slowly, hung his coat near the fire, then sat across from her. The fire popped once in the silence. "I found your name carved on the ridge," he said finally. She looked up. "My name?" Belle must have left it, a small post. Your name, the deed number, a mark. Her lips parted, but she said nothing. "I can take you there," Nate added, "if you want to see it." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. They left the children asleep in the cabin that afternoon, Hazel napping with one arm slung over her carved fox. Luke snuggled in the cradle Nate had made from red pine. Lydia bundled herself in wool, and Nate led her up the ridge trail, one step at a time, her belly still tender from childbirth, but her legs strong again. The trail wound through trees heavy with dripping leaves, across rock outcroppings slick with moss. The world felt new under the rain, darker, quieter, alive in a way she hadn't noticed before. Nate moved easily, his footsteps certain. Lydia followed without fear. At the top of the ridge, a clearing opened like a secret kept. There, on a low cedar post, was her name. Lydia Mercer, claim numbered 47, red earth hollow beneath it in shaky script. Restored by Eli Bell. Lydia stared, chest tight. "It's real," she whispered. Nate didn't speak. He only reached into his coat and pulled something from inside. A small pouch, tied with sinew. He opened it carefully and removed a folded cloth. Inside was a necklace, Apache style, but simpler. A string of carved wooden beads, weathered smooth. At its center, a charm. A tiny cradle board carved from antler. "It belonged to my wife," he said. "She wore it when she carried our son." Lydia's breath caught. "Nate, I can't." He held it out. "I'm not giving it. I'm sharing it, with you. With them." Her fingers trembled as she took it. "She would have liked you," Nate said, almost to himself. "You don't waste words. You watch things. You stay." Lydia blinked quickly. "I haven't always. I ran for a long time." "You stopped," he replied. "That matters more." She looked at the charm in her hand, the weight of it more than just carved bone. It was grief, hope, trust, all in one fragile thread. The rain lightened as they walked back down the ridge. By the time they reached the hollow, the clouds had broken open just enough to show slivers of pale blue sky that evening. As the stew warmed and Hazel set the table with her tiny wooden foxes, Lydia knelt by the hearth and took the deed Eli had left. She didn't read it again. She folded it carefully and tucked it between the slats of the cabin wall, beside the cradle Nate had built. "I don't need a title to know what's mine," she murmured. Later, as the fire died down and the cabin fell into silence, Lydia leaned against the doorway, watching Nate mend Hazel's blanket by lantern light. His fingers moved slowly, steadily, never rushed. "You could have stayed alone," she said. He didn't look up. "I was. You didn't have to let us stay." He tied the last knot in the thread and set the blanket down. "You didn't ask," he said. "You just sat by my fire. And you were tired." She smiled, a small one, but real. "I'm still tired," she whispered. He stood, his gaze steady on hers. "Then rest," he said simply. "You're not running anymore." She nodded, brushing a hand across her cheek. The necklace lay warm beneath her blouse, the carved cradle pressing gently against her skin. Outside the wind was soft. The trees stood quiet. And for the first time in a long time, Lydia Mercer allowed herself to believe she had been found. Spring came like a long-held breath, finally exhaled. It crept through the valley slow and quiet, soaking the earth, loosening bark from frozen trunks, softening the hard ridges of winter's grip. At Red Earth Hollow, the snow melted in patchy fields, and green shoots began to rise stubbornly through the muddy soil. Lydia knelt beside the cabin one morning, sleeves rolled to her elbows, hands in the dirt. Hazel sat a few feet away, sorting dried beans into rows on a blanket. Luke lay on his back nearby, bundled snugly in furs, eyes blinking at the sky like he'd never seen so much color. Nate stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the tree line. He held an axe in one hand, a plank of pine in the other. But he didn't move, just stood there, silent. Lydia looked up, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "What are you thinking?" He glanced over. "About building." "A barn?" "A room." She raised an eyebrow. "A room?" "For you," he said simply. "And the children. It's time this place had more than just shelter. A real home." Lydia sat back on her heels, surprised by the lump in her throat. She looked around at the cabin they had thickened with logs and clay, the fence half-built from scavenged rails, the small patch of turned soil she'd claimed as a garden. "Feels like home already," she said softly. Nate set down the plank and walked over. He crouched beside Hazel, who handed him 2 beans as though they were rare coins. He pocketed them solemnly, making her grin. Later that day, Lydia carved the name Red Earth Hollow into a wide, flat board they'd found near the creek. She wasn't sure what made her do it. Maybe it was the way Hazel had started calling the place Our Hollow, or the way Nate said her name now, not as a guest, not as someone passing through, but as someone who'd always been meant to arrive. That night, she and Nate hung the sign above the cabin's front door. No one knew them, no ceremony, just the creak of wood, the soft thump of hammer against nail, and 2 pairs of steady hands working in rhythm. When they stepped back, Lydia saw the way the lantern light caught the words. Her chest ached, not from pain, but from the way peace sometimes hurt when it came too unexpectedly. The next morning, a rider came. He wasn't dressed like a lawman or a stranger. He was a simple man, maybe in his late 20s, with mud on his boots and a note in his pocket. He rode straight up to the hollow's edge and dismounted slowly. Nate stepped forward first, quiet but alert. Lydia followed, Hazel tucked against her hip and Luke in the sling at her chest. The rider removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, nodding, "I bring word from Dalton." Lydia stiffened. "What kind of word?" "Your name's cleared," he said. "Officially. Town council issued a statement. Story ran in the Cheyenne Ledger, too." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. Lydia took it with trembling hands. It was rough, smudged in places, but clear enough. "Mrs. Lydia Mercer, formerly of Dalton, Wyoming, is hereby exonerated of all association with the financial crimes of her late husband. Evidence has come to light, confirming her innocence." Below it, the signature of Lee Bell. Lydia's eyes burned. "Thank you," she murmured. The rider tipped his hat. "Mr. Bell said he thought you wouldn't want to come back. He said you already had everything you needed." He mounted again, turning his horse toward the trail without waiting for more. Lydia watched him go, until the sound of hoofbeats faded into birdsong. When she turned back, Nate was still there, silent, watching her. She handed him the paper. He scanned it once, then handed it back. "So," he said softly, "your name is clean." "It always was," she answered. That night, she placed the paper in a wooden box Nate had carved for Hazel's toys. Not because it wasn't important, but because it didn't need to hang on a wall. It was a document, not a definition. Spring passed into summer slowly, like a man easing into water. The garden took root. Nate taught Hazel to track birds by the sound of their wings. Lydia taught her letters, using the wooden fence as a chalkboard. Luke took his first steps in the yard, falling and laughing. his hands always reaching for the earth. One morning, as Nate repaired a section of the roof, Lydia stepped out of the cabin, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I have something for you," she said. He came down the ladder, wiping his hands. She unwrapped it, a small wooden horse, clearly carved by an amateur. Its legs were thick, its eyes uneven, but it stood, steady. "I made it," she said, embarrassed. "Took me weeks, used one of your old blades." Nate turned it over in his hands. His thumb brushed the belly, where she'd carved a single word: "Stay." He looked up. Lydia's voice was steady. "I want to, if you want me to." He nodded slowly. "You're already here." She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around his waist. He pulled her close, resting his chin atop her head. They didn't speak of marriage, of titles, of ceremonies. Their vows were daily, carved in wood and firelight and soil. Weeks later, Hazel helped hang 2 wooden birds from the porch beam, one carved by Nate, the other by Lydia. They swayed gently in the breeze, wings unfinished, but beautiful in their imperfection. On the first morning of fall, as the air turned crisp again, and the leaves began to shift, Lydia stood beside Nate at the ridge. Below them, red earth hollow stretched wide and gold in the sunlight. She reached for his hand, and he took it. "I didn't know I'd find home this way," she whispered. "Neither did I," he said. They stood in silence as Hazel's laughter echoed through the trees, and Luke toddled after her, giggling. Behind them, the cabin waited. Firewood was stacked. Stew was simmering. A new carving sat half-finished on the table. And life, steady and strong, had taken root in the red earth. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story. I'm truly glad you stayed with me. Your support means so much. Please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so I can keep bringing you more heartfelt stories like this one.